The terminal buzzed with the usual blend of corporate urgency and polished chaos. Travelers in tailored suits wheeled expensive luggage across marble floors as flight announcements echoed above them. Among the crowd, a man in a simple dark canvas jacket and faded jeans moved with quiet intent. He was neither hurried nor flashy, and no one gave him a second look. That was exactly how Jonathan Reed preferred it. Traveling under the name J. Carter. He had learned over the years that silence often spoke louder than presence. With a scuffed leather satchel slung over his shoulder and a boarding pass for seat 1A on Aerovista Flight 90, Jonathan was headed to Zurich on what most would assume was just another business trip. The gate agent barely glanced up as she scanned his boarding pass. First class all the way up, she muttered, not bothering to make eye contact. Jonathan nodded with polite indifference and stepped onto the jet bridge. Inside the plane, first class shimmered with warm lighting, polished wood accents and leather recliners. The atmosphere resembled more of an exclusive club than a commercial flight. As he made his way to 1A, the seat he had reserved and paid for weeks in advance, he paused. Douglas Hawthorne, a man in his 50s with a navy suit, Rolex and a glass of champagne already in hand, was sprawled across it like royalty. Jonathan hesitated only briefly before turning to the nearest flight attendant, a tall blonde named Amanda, who was arranging welcome drinks with robotic precision. "Excuse me," Jonathan said calmly, his voice low and composed. "I believe that's my seat." Amanda didn't even glance at his boarding pass. Instead, she scanned him. His plain clothes, his worn boots with the calculated condescension of someone who had seen enough to assume everything. "We've had a last-minute seating change," she said with a plastic smile. "That seat has been reassigned." She said it like a courtesy, not a correction. No name check, no system confirmation, just a polished dismissal. Jonathan tilted his head slightly. "I wasn't informed," he replied evenly. "This is the seat I reserved. Confirmed, paid for." Amanda lowered her voice as if she were doing him a favor. "We had a priority request from one of our platinum-tier clients. We're asking for your cooperation." Then she gestured toward row 17 business class. Jonathan looked from Amanda to Douglas, who hadn't even glanced up, then back to Amanda. The message was clear. Jonathan was the one expected to move, not because of protocol, but because of profile. Without argument, without resistance, he nodded and walked quietly down the aisle, carrying with him the weight of 1,000 similar moments, the kind that press against a man, not with volume, but with precision. He slid into seat 17C, tucked his satchel beneath his seat, and leaned back. Around him, murmurs stirred. A woman nearby whispered to her husband, maybe he used points, or maybe he won a contest. The husband chuckled. Looks like one of those indie types. Probably writes screenplays in Brooklyn. Jonathan didn't flinch. He'd heard worse. He'd endured worse. But something about today felt different. The altitude of judgment had already begun to climb. As the rest of the passengers filtered in, Jonathan kept his eyes low. The curtain to first class remained open just long enough for him to see Amanda leaning down to refill Douglas's champagne. That's when he recognized the name Douglas Hawthorne, a high-profile investor infamous for declaring on live television that diversity looks good on paper but kills profits. Jonathan had never forgotten that quote, or the smug grin that came with it. And now here Douglas was holding a glass he didn't earn in a seat that wasn't his, while the man who belonged there sat rows behind him, silenced not by volume, but by systems that still favored symbols over substance. But this wasn't just about a seat. It wasn't about champagne or legroom. This was about what people saw when they looked at a man like Jonathan and what they refused to see. The assumptions, the microaggressions, the casual elitism wrapped in procedure. Jonathan wasn't angry. He was observant, calculating. This was a test, and they were failing. Not because they made a mistake, but because they believed they hadn't. What none of them realized, not Amanda, not Douglas, not even the other passengers, was that the man in 17C wasn't just a passenger, he was the owner. And every second they underestimated him, they were writing the beginning of their own undoing. Seated quietly in 17C, Jonathan Reed placed his satchel neatly under the seat and adjusted his posture as the final boarding calls echoed faintly in the cabin. Around him, passengers murmured with low conversations and rustling newspapers. His demeanor hadn't changed, still composed, still unreadable, but beneath that calm exterior, a different kind of process had begun. With a subtle flick, Jonathan unlocked his phone. Not the one most people carry, but a separate device, sleek matte, black with no brand name, only a biometric thumb pad and an interface built for discretion. He pressed his thumb to the screen. Instantly a prompt appeared. Activate Clause 7C. Operational ethics breach. Confirm. There was no hesitation. Jonathan tapped yes. No sound, no alert, just a quiet shift in digital infrastructure that would soon ripple far beyond the walls of the plane. What the flight crew didn't know and couldn't have guessed was that Clause 7C wasn't just an alert. It was a corporate failsafe embedded in the governance code of Aerovista Airlines, triggered only by verified controlling stakeholders in the event of real-time breaches in operational ethics. Jonathan, through his privately held investment firm, Branlow Capital, held a 46% controlling interest in Aerovista, a fact known to only a handful of executives across the globe. But now that silence had ended, within seconds of the clause being triggered, a compliance terminal inside Aerovista's Zurich legal headquarters. Flashed red screens in the Chicago operations office began blinking as automated oversight systems detected a live breach initiated from seat 17C phone lines buzzed. Internal chats flooded legal departments scrambled for context. The identity of Jay Carter had now been cross-verified with Branlow's executive register. Jonathan Reed's name lit up under controlling authority. Special Access Protocol Level Alpha. Back on board Flight 912, nothing appeared out of the ordinary, at least on the surface. Amanda moved about with the confidence of someone who believed she had handled a minor inconvenience with grace. Eric, the flight manager, checked inventory logs and delegated pre-takeoff prep like it was just another transatlantic flight. But something in the cabin had begun to shift, subtle at first, barely visible. A young woman in business class glanced over her shoulder toward 17C, squinting as if trying to place the man behind the stillness. 2 rows up, a teenage boy nudged his mother and whispered, "Isn't that the guy from that investor magazine?" She shook her head, uncertain. But questions had begun to form, unspoken, yet present, carried on sideways glances and second takes. Meanwhile, in first class, Douglas Hawthorne continued sipping champagne blissfully. Unaware, he cracked a joke to his seatmate about keeping riffraff out of premium cabins and chuckled to himself like a king holding court. Amanda, passing by, gave a polite laugh, still unaware that her world had begun unraveling the moment she brushed Jonathan aside. She didn't know about Zurich. She didn't know about Branlow Capital, and she certainly didn't know that every word she had spoken since boarding was now being recorded under executive oversight. In the cockpit, the pilot's interface began receiving unusual system flags, minor alerts, nothing disruptive, but enough to make Captain Holmes raise an eyebrow and ask his first officer to keep an eye on the tablet feed. The ripples traveled faster than turbulence. Within 10 minutes of Jonathan's activation, a secure channel opened on Aerovista's central server, one used only during shareholder emergencies or high-level integrity breaches. Inside a sleek Chicago conference room, Megan Trask, Aerovista's general counsel, was pulled from a leadership seminar with a whisper. Clause 7C is live. It's coming from a flight. Megan froze. What flight? 912 JFK to Zurich. Passenger ID Jonathan Reed. The silence that followed was the kind that makes your stomach drop. He's on the plane. He's in row 17C. Megan closed her laptop, cancelled her afternoon, and walked straight to crisis control. Initiate full chain notification. Zurich operations investor. Relations everyone, now. And still Jonathan remained still. Not reading, not speaking, just waiting. He could feel the tension shifting, not from panic, but from pattern disruption. Passengers began to glance more frequently in his direction. A middle-aged businessman stopped mid-email to peek down the aisle. Amanda walked by for the third time in 5 minutes, her pace slightly less confident, her glances more curious. Jonathan didn't acknowledge her. He didn't need to, because the storm wasn't coming. It had already begun, and Amanda and Eric were standing directly in its eye, still thinking they were navigating clear skies. In the third row of business class, a college student named Maya Jennings had been casually scrolling through her phone waiting for takeoff. A journalism major from NYU, she had an instinct for observation and a tendency to document anything that felt off. What she'd witnessed a few minutes ago, the man in plain clothes being removed from first class without a word of protest, had struck her as odd enough to record. She hadn't known who he was at the time, just that the interaction felt wrong. So she zoomed in discreetly from her seat and captured the moment Amanda had waved off the man, now sitting quietly in 17C. The video tagged Jeebhansh Flight 112 and Bug First Class Bias was posted on her account with a quick caption. They kicked this guy out of first class so some finance bro could sit alone. Smells like profiling to me. Within minutes, the post hit 100,000 views. 10 minutes later, 500,000. The algorithm had found its fuel. As Maya refreshed her feed, her screen froze momentarily, then flooded with shares, comments, retweets. Someone had replied with a screenshot. Jonathan Reed, CEO-level investor, Branlow Capital, silent majority stakeholder in AeroVista. The realization hit hard. This wasn't just a customer being treated poorly. This was the man who effectively owned the airline being publicly dismissed, insulted, and pushed aside. By the time the video crossed the million-view mark, it had caught the attention of multiple financial journalists, equity analysts, and digital watchdog accounts. Headlines sprang to life. First-class scandal. AeroVista kicks out its own boss. Stockholders in panic. After viral video identifies passenger as controlling stakeholder. On the plane, nothing had changed yet, but online the storm had started to rage. In Manhattan, at the headquarters of Branlow Capital, an emergency meeting was convened before lunch. Trading desks paused as alerts began flashing AeroVista share volatility. 12% drop in 20 minutes. As investors scrambled, Jonathan's identity and stake were confirmed by multiple sources. CNBC ran a special update. Bloomberg issued a financial alert. Shares continued to plummet as traders offloaded AeroVista holdings en masse. The crash wasn't subtle, it was sharp, targeted, and devastating. In under an hour, the airline lost over $500 million in market value, but inside Flight 92, Jonathan hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken. His posture was the same, upright, composed, deliberate. Not even Maya knew she had sparked a corporate reckoning. Not yet. Passengers began receiving push notifications mid-flight. Whispers traveled like cabin pressure, low and quick. A man in seat 15B leaned across the aisle. Is that the same guy? A flight attendant paused mid-service when she saw her own crew's photo attached to a breaking headline. Amanda, still blissfully unaware, passed down a tray of warm towels, her face composed, but now tinged with slight confusion as she sensed the atmosphere shifting. Eric, the flight manager, tapped his tablet and frowned. "Why am I getting compliance alerts?" he muttered. But before anyone could answer, Maya's video hit TikTok, where it exploded again. This time with music, this time with outrage. Man removed from first class for not looking the part. Turns out he owns the airline. The internet wasn't just watching. It was erupting through it all. Jonathan said nothing. He didn't correct anyone, didn't rise from his seat or demand attention. His silence was not passivity. It was power, letting the system reveal itself without interference. A lesser man might have made a scene, demanded to be reseated, called for managers, or launched into a tirade. But Jonathan didn't need validation. He had truth. He had proof. And now he had a platform that wasn't of his own making, but one the world had built for him out of collective accountability. His quiet presence became a mirror to everything the airline claimed to value: respect, professionalism, equity, and everything it had just failed to deliver. The reckoning had begun, and it wasn't driven by anger. It was driven by clarity. As the sun set over the Atlantic and Flight 912 cruised at 38,000 feet, the divide between appearance and authority, between perception and reality, had never been wider. The man in seat 17C, unassuming quiet, judged and dismissed, was now trending globally. His name flashing across stock tickers, news feeds, and internal corporate emails. Jonathan's phone buzzed once, an encrypted notification confirming full stakeholder disclosure had gone public. He placed the phone face down on his tray and folded his hands. No celebration, no smugness, just a man watching a system hold itself accountable for once. Not because someone shouted, but because someone watched and the world refused to stay silent. By the time the cabin lights dimmed for mid-cruise relaxation, Eric Monroe, the flight manager, had seen enough alerts on his crew tablet to know something was seriously wrong. The red compliance banner blinking at the top of the screen read, Clause 7C, Active Executive Oversight Engaged. He'd never seen it triggered before. Most of the crew hadn't even heard of it. He tapped into the manifest, found the name J. Carter listed under 17C, and cross-referenced the back-end system. The screen returned one chilling confirmation. Jonathan Reed, verified controlling stakeholder. Branlow Capital, 46% ownership. Aerovista Airlines. Eric's stomach dropped. The man Amanda had moved without a second glance wasn't just a disgruntled passenger. He was the man who had the legal authority to dismantle everything they were flying on mid-air. He stood up, took a deep breath, and walked the length of the cabin to face the storm he now realized they had created. Reaching row 17, Eric crouched slightly, forcing a tight smile as he tried to maintain professionalism through clenched nerves. Mr. Carter, Mr. Reed, he stammered. We've just been made aware of a situation. There appears to have been a misunderstanding regarding your seating assignment, and we'd like to correct it immediately. Jonathan looked up slowly, his face unreadable. He let the silence sit between them for just a moment too long. This isn't a misunderstanding, Eric, he said, voice calm but firm. This is a reflection of how your team decides who deserves dignity and who doesn't. You didn't check my name. You didn't check the facts. You just followed a script, one written by bias and wrapped in protocol. Eric opened his mouth but had no response. Let's not pretend this was an error. Jonathan continued. It was a mirror. And now you're seeing your reflection. He stood up, slowly adjusted his jacket and walked forward. The aisle seemed to part before him, passengers falling into silence as they realized something was happening, something they didn't yet understand, but couldn't ignore. Jonathan didn't move with vengeance or speed. He moved like a man reclaiming what had always been his, not just a seat, but the right to be seen. As he approached first class, Amanda looked up from her station, her eyes catching his for a split second before flicking nervously to Eric, who trailed behind Douglas Hawthorne, still sprawled in seat 1A, raised an eyebrow and smirked. Back again, he said smugly. Thought you were downgraded. Jonathan didn't flinch. He walked past Eric, past Amanda, and stopped directly in front of Douglas. His voice didn't rise, but it carried like thunder. You mistook silence for submission. That was your first mistake. Amanda's face turned pale. Jonathan turned to her. You moved me without asking for my name. You made a decision based on appearance, not information. Amanda stammered. I was following procedure. Jonathan's gaze didn't waver. No, you were following prejudice packaged as policy. At that moment, the cockpit received a message from HQ Legal. Oversight activated. Clause 7C. Confirmed. Immediate audit pending. Inside the Zurich Operations Center, merger documentation with SkyConnect Airlines was being paused, frozen by a directive Jonathan had issued through his Branlow portal. The deal valued at $2.1 billion was instantly suspended. No explanation needed. No press release issued, just power. Exercised in complete measured silence, back in seat. Jonathan sat down with deliberate grace, fastened his belt, and leaned back slightly. Douglas was speechless. Amanda stood frozen beside the galley curtain, her hand gripping the edge, as if it could anchor her to a reality that was slipping away. On her crew tablet alerts now named her directly, crew misconduct flagged, subject A. Collins, incident, under investigation. Eric received his own notification, along with a directive to preserve flight audio logs and prepare for a formal review upon landing. As these digital ripples echoed through Aerovista's internal systems, the cabin descended into a strange silence, not relaxed but heavy. Every passenger who had whispered assumptions earlier now avoided Jonathan's gaze, suddenly aware of just how wrong they had been. Within 25 minutes of Jonathan reclaiming 1A Aerovista's stock had dropped an additional 14%. In a conference room in Midtown Manhattan, the boardroom lights were still on, filled with exhausted legal teams trying to assess the damage. One executive blurted, "We gave this man a seat in business class. He gave us a corporate reckoning." Another simply nodded, and we earned every second of it. On board Flight 9112. The only sound was the low hum of engines and the gentle clink of ice in untouched glasses. Jonathan sat still watching the clouds roll by through the small oval window. He wasn't seeking revenge, he was ensuring accountability. And everyone, Amanda, Eric Douglas, and the dozens watching silently, understood that from this moment forward, nothing about this flight, this airline, or this culture would remain untouched. The wheels of Flight 922 touched down on Zurich's runway. Just past sunrise, the landing, as smooth and controlled as the man who had silently guided the airline through its most humiliating public reckoning. Inside the aircraft, the mood had shifted entirely. There was no polite applause, no post-landing chatter, only a kind of stiff, suspended silence, as if everyone aboard instinctively understood they had witnessed something far more profound than a seating mistake. Minutes after taxiing to the gate, two men in dark suits from Aerovista's Internal Affairs Division boarded discreetly through the front hatch. With professional detachment, they approached Amanda Collins and Eric Monroe, each presented with formal notices and instructed to remain on board for immediate debrief and suspension. Pending investigation, Amanda sat motionless, her eyes fixed on the floor, her tablet already confiscated. Eric, pale and sweating, handed his over without protest. There were no protests, no excuses, only consequences. Further back in the galley, Evan Ross, the youngest flight attendant on board, stood near the service cart, visibly shaken but grounded in quiet awareness. He had overheard the whispers, he had seen the reactions, and more importantly, he had felt the moment when truth cracked through the surface of protocol. As Jonathan Reed prepared to disembark, he slowed near Evan, pausing just long enough for their eyes to meet. Evan started to speak an apology, perhaps, but Jonathan held up a hand gently, not to silence him, but to acknowledge him. "You weren't the problem," Jonathan said softly. "But now you know, so decide who you'll be next time." Evan nodded, his breath catching slightly in his throat. That single sentence, unspoken to the others, but delivered with weight, would echo far beyond the cabin doors. Outside the plane, Zurich's cold air met warm breath as media vans, security details, and corporate handlers swirled around the tarmac. But Jonathan walked calmly through the crowd, not flanked by lawyers or press liaisons. Just a man in a quiet coat carrying a satchel and resolve. He offered no interviews, no statements, no public gesture of retribution. Instead, he disappeared into a waiting car with tinted windows while the headlines continued to spiral around his name. The next day, every major outlet covered the story: airline CEO ejected from his own seat, Aerovista's 500-meter culture crash, and the power of quiet leadership. But Jonathan never responded to the noise. He didn't need to. The message had already landed louder than any press release ever could. 3 days later, a handwritten letter appeared on Evan's personal blog. The title was simple: The Cost of Silence. In it, he detailed the incident not from a position of defense, but of reflection. He admitted his discomfort, his hesitation, and most importantly, his failure to speak up when it mattered. "I watched something I knew was wrong," he wrote, "and I did nothing. That silence is mine, and I intend to pay for it." He pledged 6 months of his salary to a fund supporting frontline airline employees who faced discrimination and ethical pressure. The letter quickly went viral, resonating across industries. Thousands shared their own stories in the comments, CEOs reposted it, leaders cited it in boardrooms and quietly without fanfare or press. Branlow Capital matched Evans' donation, tenfold seeding the fund with enough capital to create a long-term impact. No name was attached to the transfer, but everyone knew where it came from. Back at Aerovista, internal restructuring had begun. First-class training protocols were overhauled. A new executive diversity council was formed. Amanda's and Eric's roles remained suspended pending deeper review, but the airline's leadership understood this wasn't about individuals, it was about patterns, culture, and accountability. Jonathan never once called for their firing. He didn't need to. He had done something far more radical. He held up a mirror and forced the system to see itself. And in doing so, he changed the conversation from corporate optics to human values. Meetings were no longer about optics. They were about outcomes, about the invisible choices made when no one is looking. Jonathan Reed never raised his voice. He never demanded respect. He simply lived it. In a world obsessed with grandstanding and noise, he reminded everyone that power is not in how loud you speak, but in what you choose to fix when no one is watching. Seat 17C was never about comfort. It was about clarity. And as Aerovista rebuilds flight-by-flight interaction by interaction, it carries a new legacy in its cabin, a quiet redemption born not from revenge, but from vision. The man who once sat quietly behind the curtain now leads from within it, not to be seen, but to ensure others are. If this story moved, you don't just scroll past. Be part of the change. At Deep Inside HQ, we bring you stories that challenge assumptions, expose hidden truths, and shine a light on the quiet heroes reshaping our world. Subscribe now to never miss a moment of real transformation. Drop a comment below and share what part of this story hit you the hardest. And if you believe in dignity, accountability, and the power of silent leadership, share this video so others can see what happens when the right person refuses to stay quiet.